Hey, my name is Josh, and I've worked in the project economy for over a decade. I've been in the trenches as an individual contributor. I've led teams that's built incredible products. And I've coached businesses and leadership through Agile transformations. This is the second video of a multi-part series guiding you through the journey of learning project management. Here's what you're going to get out of the second destination on the roadmap. We're going to shine a spotlight on how projects unfold in ideal circumstances and what happens in real life. In this video, we're going to walk through an ideal project as defined by PMI. Now, we aren't going to deep dive every process or discuss its ethos. That's the inputs, tools and techniques, and outputs, as that's going to come in a later video. Now, in the next video, after this one, I'll pull back the curtain and show you what it's really like to work in different scenarios, company sizes, and environments so you won't be caught off guard like I was when I first started learning project management. I think you're going to be really shocked at what gets cut out in the real world. So, let's get started. All projects start out with an idea. Put simply, someone thought up an idea to transform their current situation into a better situation. That may come in the form of intangible or even tangible value. Folks think up these ideas and want to pursue projects, defend their ideas in an artifact called a business case. The business case, it's a formal document that comes in various shapes and sizes at different companies. Ultimately, the person that is arguing in favor of their idea is trying to provide a solid reason to why the company should invest. The business case often includes the definition of the problem, potential solutions, company benefits for pursuing the solution, likely stakeholders that are involved, associated costs, and even market research that ties everything together. The business case is then put in front of a steering committee. The steering committee are made up of individuals within the organization's leadership that are capable of authorizing a project and greenlighting someone to use company resources to solve the defined problem. Let's take a quick look at an example of a business case, which takes on the format of a business case canvas. We've created a fictitious company called Blue Chair Software that is exploring the idea of developing a new app within their product ecosystem. The vision of this new app is a collaborative whiteboard application that brings remote teams together. Please feel free to pause the video and read through the business case canvas. It contains details about the problem, potential solutions, benefits, costs, success metrics, and so much more. The reason I'm showing you this is to give you a bigger picture of what occurs prior to when a project manager is brought into a project. Once you're finished, come back and we'll talk about phase gates. Let's pretend that after rigorous debate, the steering committee approves the business case. This go or no-go decision occurs in what is called a phase gate. Phase gates are often formal meetings that allow the bigwigs of companies to discuss why they see themselves as important and if they're ready to move the idea to the next stage. The next stage in this case is to create a project charter, which officially authorizes a project manager to manage a project. Now, project charters are the birth certificates of projects. It's a formal announcement that the business is investing their resources into a project. The project charter is often written by the project sponsor and project manager. It is the guiding light for the project and should be a reference tool throughout the project's lifecycle. Project charters typically outline the project name, project goals, the team doing the work, milestones, high-level scope overview, some associated costs and assumptions, risks, and even constraints. Much like the business case, project charters come in all different formats and are customized to the organization's needs. You won't be able to complete the project charter until you start identifying stakeholders. Ricardo Vargas was right when he said if the process is rigid, it is wrong. You should be identifying stakeholders throughout the entire project lifecycle. You do not identify stakeholders early in the project and then never revisit the identifying stakeholders process. You'll be jumping back and forth between the different processes throughout the entire project. This is a fluid process. Honestly, if there's one thing that you take away from this entire video, it is that you're constantly moving between the different processes. The project charter and identifying stakeholders are the two processes within the initiation process group. It's important to call out that if you open up the PMBOK and take a look at the process group chart, the business case isn't listed anywhere on it. That's because PMI lists the business case as an input into the project charter, rather than a process that stands alone. We aren't going to get into discussing the EDOS, as that's way too far into the weeds for this particular video. We'll cover the inputs, tools and techniques, and outputs, also known as EDOS, in a different video. So let's do a recap. The meat and potatoes of the initiation process is all about creating the project charter and identifying stakeholders. The company will use a business case to justify why they're pursuing a solution to a problem, and the project charter will capture the what and how of the solution. You gotta know who is involved, both externally and internally, when managing a project, which is why identifying stakeholders is the second process in a project lifecycle. Up next is the planning process group. You'll start by creating the project management plan, which consists of, get ready, it's a lot, the scope, schedule, cost, quality, communication, risk, stakeholder, and procurement management plans. This is where all 10 of the different knowledge areas start to tie together. Now, if you were counting along, you probably realized I named 9 different knowledge areas if you included planning. That's a good catch, because the remaining knowledge area is integration. And integration, well, it's all around us. It's the connective tissue that allows fluidity instead of rigidness. Remember, if it's rigid, it's wrong. You may revisit a process numerous times throughout a project. And in fact, you may update the work breakdown structure, as an example, numerous times in the same hour. It's okay to hop between the different processes, because if you're not doing that, you may actually need to watch this video several more times. And hey, that's okay too. I used to have certain lectures on loop until the material clicked. That's completely normal. Anyway, after establishing a project charter and identifying stakeholders for your project, you'll want to start working on your project management plans. I'm placing an emphasis on the plural of plans because anytime you see plan, knowledge area, management, it means you're writing down the governance of how you're going to operate within that knowledge area's process. Think of it as rules of the road. Imagine driving your vehicle through town and you're the only person that has ever read the driver's license manual. No one's going to stop for red lights. People are going to drive like Richard Petty, and you're white-knuckling the steering wheel the entire time. Now, I live in Nashville. I know the folks around here have mostly read the driver's license manual, and I still frequently wonder if their cornbread ain't done in the middle. Everyone has to play by the same rules, and that's why you write things down. Like, what happens if a stakeholder wants to add a new feature? How will you prevent scope creep? How will scope even be approved? All of these questions and processes should be written down and agreed upon by the project team and business. You need to do this with each knowledge area so everyone knows the rules of the road. I often tell folks to avoid being the first project manager on the beach unless you've got some notches in your belt. The reason is that an organization's first project manager has to get stakeholders, primarily leadership, to agree to governance procedures. It can be a monumental task, especially when leadership folks don't see the value of good project management. Regardless of when you land on the beach, make sure that the rules of the road are written down somewhere and everyone agrees upon it. The first knowledge area plan you'll want to tackle is the scope management plan. The scope management plan is going to house all of the governance related to managing your project scope. It includes answers to questions like, how are you going to collect requirements? What is the process you'll use to determine if the scope should be expanded or reduced? What even is the scope? What is out of scope? All of this should live within the scope management plan. It's important to call out now that you won't complete these knowledge area plans in one sitting. There's going to be a lot of back and forth between the different processes throughout the entire project lifecycle, so don't stress. The reason you start with scope is that you have to know what you're building. Then you can figure out your schedule, how much it's going to cost. You can determine quality standards, figure out the resources needed to build it, and how you'll communicate throughout the project. Inevitably, people are going to start asking questions about the project. So you'll need to figure out how you'll identify and manage risks along with how purchasing is going to shake out in your project. You'll have to manage stakeholders too, so spend some time figuring that out. Only then can you actually roll up your sleeves with your team and get to building. Now that you have an overview of how all of this is going to work, let's continue down the road of building out your scope management plan. The next step is to collect requirements from stakeholders. You'll reference that stakeholder register that you created when you identified stakeholders to figure out who will need to be interviewed for requirements gathering. Let's take a look at an example stakeholder register really quick. It looks like there's several people here that we'll need to chat with to figure out product requirements. These requirements can be both functional and non-functional. There are all sorts of tools and techniques you can use to effectively capture requirements in a project. The requirements traceability matrix, which again comes in all different formats and sizes, is one example of a tool that you can use to document what you learn from your stakeholders. Let's pretend that we've interviewed the stakeholders and have documented their responses in a requirements traceability matrix. The reason you take the extra time to write things down in a traceability matrix is because you will absolutely forget who asked for something later in the project. Trust me. Let's say that we're 5 months into development and an engineer has a question on which hexadecimal colors should be used for the post-it notes in the UI. Well, it's been a minute, and if you're like me, you probably won't remember. The good news is your past self was looking out for your future self. You jotted down who submitted the color code requirements in the requirements traceability matrix. Now, you just need to go talk with that person and figure out the color that they wanted in the app. Problem solved. It's that easy. You'll need to create your scope statement after collecting your requirements. The defined scope process is all about describing the product you're building in the project. You'll capture what is in scope, what is out of scope, goals and objectives, assumptions, risks, constraints, and so much more. Some of this can be lifted from the project charter to reduce rework, so keep that in mind. The scope statement is the written definition of the project. The create WBS, or work breakdown structure, is the process to break work down into the smallest pieces possible. This is how you eat an elephant. It's one bite at a time. The work breakdown structure is a hierarchical graph displaying the work decomposition of a project. Let's take a look at a work breakdown structure example. I'm a big foodie, so let's look at how we would approach delivering Taco Tuesday. Row 1, it's Taco Tuesday. It's the ultimate goal of our project. In row 2, we've broken down the large pieces of work we'll need to complete to make Taco Tuesday a reality. We'll need a recipe, create a grocery list, acquire some ingredients, do some meal prep, cook up delicious tacos, plate up our food, pour out our beverages, eat the food, and then clean up our dirty dishes. Work breakdown structures are relative to the size of your project. The goal is to break your work down into the smallest pieces possible so that you're able to progress toward project success without spinning your wheels too much. Please feel free to pause the video and check out the WBS for as long as you need. Then come back here and I'll drop some added knowledge on you. Have you ever heard of user story maps? If not, that's okay. They're pretty similar to work breakdown structures, only user story maps also divide work into release forecasts. It's a mixture between work breakdown structures combined with schedule forecasts. We'll do an entire video on how you create a WBS as well as a user story map in the future. Speaking of schedules, you can only figure out the schedule once you roughly know what you're going to build. The first thing you need to do when it comes to managing the schedule is to write down the rules of the road. Planned schedule management answers questions related to scheduling. What would you do if activities become late? How do you respond if you're ahead of schedule? What techniques do you use to estimate task durations? What tool will be used to sequence work visually? All of these questions and answers feed into defining activities of the scope. Let's take a look at that WBS again and how we define the scope for Taco Tuesday. Row 3 and beyond are the activities needed to create delicious tacos. We'll need to figure out a recipe, determine our ingredients list, do some meal prepping, cooking, and eventually serving delicious tacos for dinner. Or breakfast. Hey, I've been there. I'm not hating, you do you. The point is, the purpose of defining activities is to help identify and break down the work that will live within the work breakdown structure. The highest level, in this case, row 1, represents Taco Tuesday. It's the goal of our project. The second row contains the individual high-level deliverables that are necessary to make Taco Tuesday a reality. There are certain best practices when decomposing work that we won't get into here, but we will in later videos, so keep that in mind. The most important thing to remember is that you should try to break the work down into the smallest work package as possible. The work packages feed upward into higher level deliverables that eventually shakes out into you stuffing your face with tacos on Tuesday. Oftentimes, as you're defining activities, you'll also sequence activities. Whether you're building a work breakdown structure or a user story map, oftentimes the work is listed out in the order in which you'll tackle it in the project. But that's not always the case. The sequence activities process has a bit more to it than simply rearranging work in the order in which it'll be done. Have you ever heard of critical path theory? That technique overlaps with the process estimate durations when creating a network diagram. Now, in short, the network diagram identifies the order in which work is completed, the time estimates, and your lead and lag durations. All of that combined determines the longest path in time from start to finish to complete the project. We'll cover all of this in more detail in a later video. The point I want to drive home is you're going to be bouncing between building your work breakdown structure, defining activities, and sequencing the work. Regardless of whether you're in a predictive, hybrid, or agile approach, this is a fluid process because you'll probably uncover new requirements and stakeholders along the way, and you need to refine your project scope. If you're not revisiting these processes throughout the entire project, you're doing it wrong. All in all, you're going to be here for a minute. Eventually, you'll be able to put together some sort of schedule. This is accomplished through the develop schedule process. Developing a schedule forecast is an iterative process. Have you ever heard of cone of uncertainty? The TLDR here is that you really only understand what's immediately in front of your team, plus or minus a few weeks. Anything beyond that is usually too much in the gray area to confidently know within a reasonable certainty. Now, I know leadership doesn't like hearing it, but we are not fortune tellers. We cannot see the future, nor can we predict it. It's better to be roughly right than precisely wrong. Project management has existed for thousands of years, which means we have a lot of historical data to point to help us. But ultimately, every team is different. That's why it's critical to bounce between these processes to ensure you have the most up-to-date information regarding your project scope and schedule. Things are gonna go off the rails at times, so be ready to fix it rather than just standing back watching it burn. As the old saying goes, time is money, which brings us to the next knowledge area, cost management. The cost management plan contains all the answers to the burning questions of how you're going to manage your project's budget. How are you going to determine the cost of development? How will costs be managed and monitored throughout the project? What will you do if the project exceeds the approved budget? These questions should be answered within the cost management plan. Oftentimes, though, cost management, specifically budgets, are handled at a more senior level at a company. Now, that doesn't mean you shouldn't take time to figure all this stuff out, just that someone else might be doing this portion of the work. You're able to estimate costs because you've already defined the scope, created a work breakdown structure, defined and sequenced the work activities, and developed a schedule. All of these tie together, allowing project managers to determine the budget of their projects. Here's an example. Let's say that Blue Chair Software only has $500,000 in their budget to develop the whiteboard app. If the desired scope comes back at an estimated cost of $750,000, then you immediately know you got to cut some scope somewhere or ask for more money. The cool part is that you determined a budgetary discrepancy before work even started. That saves a lot of heartache at smaller companies. We aren't going to get into the nitty-gritty of how you estimate costs for projects. There are numerous methods folks use to get high-level estimates at the beginning of a project lifecycle and more dialed-in approaches to figure out current costs and projected costs. We'll talk about that in other videos, as that's way too in the weeds for this particular video. Anytime you pay for something, you want it to be high quality. That's why the next thing you'll do is plan quality management. What is quality? What criteria will you use to measure the quality of a deliverable? What happens if a deliverable doesn't meet quality standards? All of these rules regarding project quality will be captured within the quality management plan. The other processes within the quality management knowledge area fall into the executing and monitoring and controlling process groups. We'll cover those in a bit. After understanding what you're going to build, when you're going to build it, how much it's going to cost to build it, and the quality of what you want to build, you'll need to figure out the resources you'll need during the project. Planned resource management contains answers to how you'll acquire, estimate, and manage the materials and people you'll need throughout the project. Before we go any further though, I know that these terms are industry standard for business management, but I want to say that referring to people as resources or human capital, it's degrading and insulting. We are people. We aren't machines, despite the fact that corporations see us only as numbers. Remember that when you talk to your teams. People don't remember what you did day to day, but they will remember how you made them feel. Now that I'm off the horse, the next thing you'll do is estimate the resources that you'll need throughout the project. Estimate resources produces a resource breakdown structure that looks similar to the work breakdown structure. The resource breakdown structure comes in all different sizes and formats. Let's take a quick peek at an example resource breakdown structure that overlaps with the Taco Tuesday work breakdown structure we saw earlier. We can use this breakdown to better understand what utensils, cooking equipment, ingredients, and people will need to make Taco Tuesday a hit. Estimating resources is a lot more complex than this in a real project, but it should help you gain a mental image of the necessary steps that you'll think through when in a real-world project. Here's where the cone of uncertainty will rear its ugly head again. You may or may not be able to fully identify all the resources you'll need or how long you'll need them early in a project. That's okay. That's why it's critical that you remain fluid and bounce back to the estimate resources process when you identify something new that requires materials or people. Remember, if you're only able to access a particular resource at a certain time, then your schedule needs to reflect it. That likely will impact your activity sequence, as the material is a blocker for the work that needs to be completed. It's important to call out that some of these procedures may already exist within your organization, since this overlaps with procurement and other departments. When in doubt, ask your project sponsor. Speaking of which, you're going to need to start communicating with your project team and stakeholders about the information you've discovered so far within the planning process group. Planned communications management contains your approach to the communicating with the folks interested or impacted by your project. You'll need to document the what, how, and who you'll communicate to throughout the project. Stakeholders should be able to look at your communication plan and determine when the next project update meeting will occur and how they're able to access the information radiators. Now, if you've never heard of the term information radiator, it's just a fancy term for putting a crap load of information related to the project in one place that, well, radiates project information. Think of it as your one-stop shop for all things about your project. We'll chat more about information radiators in future videos. Communication with stakeholders inevitably leads to discussions involving existing issues and potential risks to the project. The best project managers I've ever worked with made it their mission to become information brokers, which in turn meant that their teams and managers were never blindsided. Some things just happen in life and are completely unexpected, but as project managers, we should try looking around the corner as frequently as possible. Planned risk management is all about looking around corners. The risk management plan should capture how you identify risks and how you determine your organization's tolerance to those risks. That's pretty much it. You'll want to include details about how you're measuring risks, formulas used to calculate risk tolerance, and access to any relevant artifacts. The identify risk process truly depends on your risk tolerance of your organization. How do you identify risks? Talk to your team. Listen to what they're calling out throughout the project, regardless of where the meeting or where the conversation is occurring. They are the experts that will guide you through the risk identification process. The project sponsor will be able to help you determine what is or is not a risk based on their risk appetite or risk tolerance. Here's an example. Let's say that we're the project manager for the whiteboard app at Blue Chair Software. We're going to be going to a conference in 2 weeks and will likely want to demo our app to a few select potential clients. We've recently identified a non-critical bug in our app, and it's going to take about a week to deploy a fix. What is our risk tolerance to allow that bug to exist while we're giving a software demo? Let's think about it. First off, it's a non-critical bug, and we've already identified how to replicate it. We would probably be able to stomach this bug existing while we're chatting with clients because it's non-critical to our happy path. Our risk tolerance would be high in this case. Now, we'd be having a totally different conversation if that app crashed every time you selected a primary feature, say the text tool. The risk tolerance for that bug would be at or near zero. We wouldn't be able to provide a demo because a primary feature wouldn't be working. Our risk tolerance would be low in this case. Risks can either be negative or positive, so keep that in mind. It's unlikely you'll respond to everything that you identify. Let's break it down into more simple terms. Most of the time, projects perform qualitative risk analysis and label risks as low, medium, or high probability and impact. Quantitative risk analysis is much harder to complete, typically due to the lack of data to support a thorough mathematical analysis. Quantitative risk analysis can also be expensive to perform, which is why understanding the organization's risk tolerance is so important. You simply wouldn't perform quantitative risk analysis on a risk that has trivial impact to your project. Regardless of whether you perform a quantitative or qualitative risk analysis, you'll need to plan risk responses afterwards. As I mentioned a moment ago, risks can be both negative or positive. Let's say that you've identified a risk that it typically rains heavily in the month of September and the job site might get flooded. You'll need to plan a response to that risk if it becomes an issue in September. Planning out responses to risks help us figure out how we can mitigate, exploit, transfer, or accept future risks. This whole topic regarding risk responses deserves its own individual video, so we won't get too far into the weeds here. What you need to know is that all of this information, regardless of the type of analysis, should exist within a risk register. Similar to the previous processes, you may jump back to the determined budget process if you need to purchase insurance for a high probability risk, or hop over to the WBS and define a new work package if you've figured out a new deliverable is required along the way. The planned procurement management process contains your decision-making process on whether you would make or buy something. Like we just mentioned a moment ago, let's say that you've identified a risk where you can transfer a potential loss to another party through insurance. The procurement management plan would contain all the details and procedures related to purchasing for your project. If your company has a dedicated procurement department, well, the procurement plan typically becomes more about how to interact and request purchases from your procurement department rather than directly handling all of the project purchases. When in doubt, ask your sponsor. Lastly, in the planning process group, you'll want to plan stakeholder engagement. Stakeholder engagement is closely connected with communications. That's why when you're planning stakeholder engagement, you'll likely want to ensure your communication plan reflects your intent. you may opt to build a stakeholder matrix, which is a tool to plot stakeholders on a grid to determine their influence and impact on the project. This helps you figure out whether you should monitor, keep informed, keep satisfied, or manage a stakeholder closely. Here's what that looks like. Let's pretend we're the project manager at Blue Chair Software and have identified 8 different stakeholders on the project. We know that stakeholder number 5 is a critical subject matter expert, has high influence, but isn't all that interested in our project. How are we going to manage this stakeholder? We need to ensure that we keep the stakeholders satisfied so they're willing to play ball with us. We'll build part of our communication strategy around the needs of this particular stakeholder. That doesn't mean stakeholder number 5 is the golden goose of the project. It just means we need to think through how we ensure we keep them satisfied. Again, this is a fluid process and is interconnected with other processes. This is not a one and done approach. Whenever you identify a new stakeholder, you'll want to include them in the stakeholder matrix. In fact, stakeholder number 5 may lose influence over the life cycle of the project. If that happens, simply readjust the stakeholder matrix. We've covered a lot of material in this section, so let's take a moment and do a quick high-level recap. You need to first understand what you're building in order to figure out how long it will take to build. Then, you'll have to figure out all the associated costs for the resources and people, plus the build quality standards. You'll need to figure out your make or buy process and document that in your procurement management plan. To tie everything together, you'll also have to figure out how you'll manage your stakeholders and communicate to them because they're inevitably going to ask you about project risks. As we transition into talking about the execution and monitoring and controlling process groups, keep in mind that you'll jump between these different processes and process groups throughout your entire project. Point in case, you should be updating the communications management plan whenever you identify a new stakeholder and plot them on the stakeholder matrix so you can figure out their engagement needs. Now, let's talk about the next 2 process groups as they're technically unfolding simultaneously. They're joined at the hip, if you will. We're going to cover execution process group first, followed by the monitoring and controlling process group. Let's get started. As you may have picked up, every process group starts with the process from the integration knowledge area. The execution process group is kicked off through the direct and manage project work process. What do you do during the direct and manage project work process? Project managers typically aren't individual contributors, meaning we aren't the ones doing the actual work. Our job is to help coordinate and direct the team and manage the work to ensure project deliverables are being produced. Despite the fact that we're living in a technologically advanced world, businesses seem to never write anything down. The managed project knowledge process is all about taking what you're learning through doing the work and recording it so you can continuously improve or share the knowledge gained within the organization. These 2 processes, direct project management work and managed project knowledge, are supported by all of the remaining processes within the execution process group. Doing the work and managing quality, acquiring resources, developing and managing your team, purchase requests, managing risks, and communicating and managing stakeholders all happen within this process group. Let's take a look at that now. You've already determined your quality standards, so now you need to manage the quality of your deliverables. Folks often think that the acquire resources process would come first in this subset of processes, as hiring your team is part of acquiring resources and personnel. However, think back to the planning process. You, as the project manager, have several deliverables you'll need to deliver before we're ever ready to hire a team or purchase equipment. The same process you'll use to manage a team member's deliverable quality applies to the work breakdown structure and other supporting artifacts in your project. That's why this is a fluid process, because not only are you bouncing between the different processes in a process group, you're bouncing between the process groups themselves. Remember, planning is a stage of a project, which means all 5 of the process groups will likely be used within a single stage. At some point, you'll need to acquire resources for your project. This process includes partnering with the conduct procurement process in order to get the necessary equipment, materials, and personnel to drive the project towards success. A good rule of thumb here is to wait until the very last responsible moment to spend money. Because once you've spent money, then the business is going to expect a return on that investment. Just like you wouldn't purchase a big ticket item a year in advance of when you would actually need it, make responsible decisions about when you're going to bring on resources to your project. And hey, listen, sometimes there's just a delay between when the resource shows up for use and when you're actually going to purchase it. You'll need to figure out when to bring that resource into the project. Like I mentioned before, you're going to hear business leaders refer to people as resources and human capital. Be a good human. Remember that people are people. Once you have people, you'll need to develop your team. Project managers are change agents. We fulfill all different sorts of roles and responsibilities, including getting people on board with the project vision. Be a leader to your team and help them navigate through Tuckman's Ladder. If you aren't familiar with Tuckman's Ladder, it's the concept that teams start off trying to get to know each other and eventually start causing friction between each other. There's going to be a lot of drama, but eventually folks figure it out and things stabilize. That's when the team rolls up their sleeves together and start producing a tremendous amount of value. Eventually, as all things do, the team will wind down and join other projects. There's 5 different stages to the Tuckman's Ladder: forming, storming, norming, performing, and adjourning. This whole topic deserves its own video. So let's get back to the next process: managing the team. If the developed team process is about helping a cohesive team where the sum is greater than the individual parts, then managed team process is all about ensuring the team is driving forward on the project work. In other words, the managed team process is purely operational. You're managing the daily work of the team itself. Wherever there are people, you'll need to manage communication to ensure everyone is aligned and folks have what they need to do their job. In planned communication management, you wrote down the different meetings you're going to host throughout the project. Well, you're actually hosting the meetings and sending out the reports during the managed communication process. Conversations always uncover risks, which means you'll need to be ready to implement risk responses when necessary. Now, earlier, we talked about the identify risk process. We mentioned an example where a non-critical bug was impacting Blue Chair Software's whiteboard app. We determined that risk tolerance for the bug was high because it wasn't impacting a primary feature within the app's happy path. What if that bug was actually the text tool that we mentioned earlier? We're most certainly going to encounter that bug when giving a client demo at the conference. So, we need to look at our risk register and follow the risk response related to critical bugs ahead of the conference. The risk response is to attempt to shuffle the in-flight work to the back burner and then tackle the bug ticket. Here's the catch though. The team is already working on equally high priority tickets and cannot accept this new work. There's just simply not enough bandwidth. The good news is that your risk response already received sign-off from the project sponsor to temporarily authorize additional hours for the project contractors, which will eat into your project budget, but you'll be able to handle any critically important bugs. The risk response for this particular scenario was to authorize additional payment toward the third-party development company. This route involved the conduct procurements as you needed to engage with the external company and purchase additional services. The conduct procurements process also includes paying for the actual materials, the equipment, the services, and any other personnel that you need in the project. Once you start spending someone else's money, you'll need to start managing stakeholder expectations. The managing stakeholder expectation process is, well, all about figuring out if your approach to having stakeholders involved in your project is succeeding or not. Here's the stakeholder matrix we looked at earlier. Let's pretend that we've noticed that stakeholder number 7 has become distant and disinterested in our project. Why is that? You need to figure out if your engagement with this stakeholder needs to change. Are they simply preoccupied with another project? Are they even aware that you're sending your project updates out in Slack? You'll want to reference your communication management plan and stakeholder engagement plan to ensure you are meeting their expectations. And if not, change a couple things. See what happens. Life is an experiment. Never underestimate the power of reaching out to a stakeholder and asking a direct question like, "Hi stakeholder, I hope you're doing well. I recently missed your presence and expertise in our project. Is everything okay? Is there anything I could be doing better to ensure I meet your expectations?" Something straight to the point like that might just give you what you need instead of spinning your wheels, guessing what the stakeholder wants or needs. Try it on for size. That stakeholder may have been moved to a different project and no one even told you. Up next is the monitoring and controlling process group. As I mentioned earlier, all of these processes are technically overlapping and sometimes unfolding simultaneously. You'll be jumping back and forth between each process and process group because project management is a fluid process. If it's rigid, it's wrong. Before we move into monitoring and controlling, let's have a quick recap of the execution process group. The execution process group is all about directing and managing project work, then continuously learning from it. You need to manage the quality of deliverables to ensure that the project quality standards are met. You need to exercise judgment calls to when you will purchase and acquire resources and personnel for your project. Remember that whenever you're dealing with someone else's money, you should try to wait until the last responsible minute to ensure that we aren't just sitting on our hands. Once you have your team, though, you'll help them navigate through Tuckman's ladder and direct them to the correct work at the right time. People are often the most challenging parts of projects, which means you'll need to manage your communication and stakeholder engagement to ensure everyone involved in the project is aligned. There's a lot of back and forth between the different processes and process groups within the execution process group. Now, let's take a look at the monitoring and controlling process group. Every process group starts with an integration knowledge area process. In this case, we'll start with monitor and control project work. Here, you'll be inspecting the project work, plans, approaches, pretty much anything and everything to see if we are making adequate progress towards value. Let's go back to that example where Blue Chair Software identified a critical bug 2 weeks ahead of a conference. The risk response we implemented was to purchase additional development services through our third-party contracting partners. But what if our offshore team wasn't able to accept the additional work? Instead, we simply had to push our entire timeline back by several days to accommodate resolving this critical issue. We would leverage the monitor and control project work process by inspecting our schedule, potentially resequencing the work, and then getting new estimates to effectively adjust our schedule. Can you see how all these processes are firing off at nearly the exact same time, constantly bouncing back and forth between the different process groups? That's why project management should be fluid, not rigid, because everything is constantly in motion. Let's say that we did end up resequencing the work, getting new estimates from our team, and adjusting our schedule. All of these changes would go through the Perform Integrated Change Control process. This is the process that allows you to make changes to your project. Because let's face it, what you started out thinking would be your scope, schedule, and cost absolutely will not be the same by the time you finish it. Short of some miracle, you will most certainly have changes in your project. The Perform Integrated Change Control process may be as simple as updating a few tickets and adjusting the timeline before sending out a project status update email. In other organizations, though, you may have to put it in front of a change control board that reviews, approves, and rejects all changes to a project. Regardless of how your business handles changes, the Perform Integrated Change Control process is the connective tissue that facilitates project changes. Let's say that Blue Chair Software is utilizing the Scrum framework in their development process. You would validate scope each time a ticket completes to ensure that the acceptance criteria, or AC, meets the definition of done. If the AC isn't satisfied, then the control scope process kicks in and allows us to figure out where we went wrong to ensure the full scope, as determined in the collect requirements and define scope processes, is successfully delivered. This may come in the form of slicing the unsatisfied AC into a new ticket, or perhaps the product owner would just reject the work and send it back into development. Whichever path ends up occurring will lead you to the control schedule process. Let's think back to that critical bug we were mentioning earlier. The team is going to a conference and wants to provide demos to potential clients, but there's a bug with the text tool. We weren't able to transfer that risk to our external services team, so we need to postpone a feature that was under development in-house to ensure that we had a stable app version with a functional text tool at the conference. The control schedule process empowers project managers to refine project schedules with new information, such as a ticket getting postponed. How does this impact our project schedule? Are there any other activities blocked because now they're going to miss a dependency? The control schedule process is an inspection tool to help realign project schedules when the schedule inevitably goes off the rails. And believe me, your project schedule will go off the rails. In turn, that means that you'll have to control costs associated with these changes. What if we have to authorize overtime? What if we need to purchase additional services or materials? This process allows us to review our project budget and determine how we're doing financially. Another example, let's say that you're working at a construction company and you've just budgeted the price of a building material, such as wood, at a particular cost in January. The contractor that you've hired is not going to be available to build until April. You'll need to leverage the control cost processes as you conduct procurement to acquire the material for the builders in May. Why is that? Because maybe the cost of wood has skyrocketed and you need to ensure that you're still able to purchase all of the necessary materials at the specified price. Otherwise, you may be in for a huge surprise and disappointment if you don't catch it early. I know I keep repeating this, but it's because I want to drive this point home. This is a fluid process. You'll be bouncing back and forth throughout all the different processes and process groups during your project. Now, let's talk about controlling quality. In the execution process group, you manage quality, ensuring that the deliverables meet quality standards and expectations. But what if they don't? The control quality process involves testing and ensuring that the quality is actually met. The manage quality process contains all the quality reports and test evaluation documentation of the quality tests performed within the control quality process. You'll be testing for the conformance and compliance specifications of each deliverable during the control quality process. There's a lot more to the control quality process than I'm alluding here, so just keep that in mind because each industry is a little bit different and sometimes heavily regulated. Next, you'll want to control resources within your project. Let's go back to that construction example. Maybe you determined you'll need a piece of heavy equipment like a backhoe to prepare the foundation of the building. The control resource process checks that the equipment is available for use when needed and released back to the rental company once the backhoe is no longer needed. You'll also want to consider if the resources are performing at your expected level. Do you need more or less of the resource? All these questions and more should be asked about your resources throughout your entire project. You'll need to monitor communications pretty much all the time. One of the biggest failures of projects typically stems from poor communication. Project managers are information brokers, so it's vital we're constantly checking to see if our communication is satisfying the needs of the project and meeting stakeholder expectations. When in doubt, have a conversation with your team. A great opportunity to discuss how you might improve communication would be within a retrospective. There are all different types of formats you can use to help facilitate this conversation. If you're consistently only asking what went well, what did not go well, and what can we improve, then maybe it's time to look at some new formats. I love adjusting the retrospective formats to my team's continuous improvement needs. Starfish, Sailboat, Three Little Pigs. There's so many different formats. And when wielded correctly, help draw people out of their shell and provide better conversation. Try it out. Like we've discussed earlier, wherever there is conversation, you will hear about potential risks. You'll need to keep your head on a swivel so you're able to monitor those risks. Again, this is a fluid process, so you'll need to chat with folks and make sure that risks haven't changed in probability or impact since the first time you discovered them. Let's consider the text tool bug example we keep going back to for a moment. What if we discovered that that issue only occurs with iOS devices? The Android build does not experience any issues with the text tool. Because we've isolated that behavior down between iOS and Android, the critical bug may not be as critical as we initially thought ahead of that conference. You know why? Because we can load up that app on an Android device and just bypass the outstanding issue. We'll still need to register the issue in our RAID log, but we no longer need to rearrange our schedule entirely. The risk we previously called out, which is our project schedule could slip, goes from a medium risk down to a low risk because we're able to continue working on the feature that was already in flight. Things can change by the minute or hour at times, so it's important to monitor risks to ensure we're looking around the corner. We'll also need to control procurements throughout our project. This includes activities like paying invoices, ensuring that payments and credits are received, managing relationships with vendors and service providers, and so much more. Last, but certainly not least, you'll want to monitor stakeholder engagement. The only constant in life is change. Stakeholders may come and go, as well as their influence and interest in projects. Trust your instincts and chat with your stakeholders if you feel something is off. They'll let you know what they need so you're able to move between the different processes and process groups to realign what you're doing to satisfy their expectations. Let's recap the monitoring and controlling process as we round the corner towards closing process group. Everything you're doing within the monitoring and controlling process group is ensuring that things are on track and the outcome is the outcome you expect. It's really that simple. You don't have to be intimidated by all the different processes and knowledge areas. The entire process, from start to finish, is by definition iterative. It's certainly not waterfall. Most projects you'll work on in your career will actually be hybrid in nature. That means you will need to tailor the processes and have a nice mixture of predictive and agile approaches. Your head needs to be on a swivel and you need to remain fluid. After completing the initiating, planning, executing, and monitoring and controlling process groups, you'll need to complete the close project phase process. Do you remember when we were breaking down the processes within the execution process group that I mentioned you would need to manage the quality of the deliverables coming out of the planning phase? This is the process that transitions project managers from each individual phase in a project. It's dual purpose. You may use it to close out a phase or close out the entire project. You'll be finalizing all activities, lessons learned, ensuring contracts have been satisfied, and so much more. We've just covered a tremendous amount of information in this video. So let's do a quick recap. Let's run through each process group at a high level. The meat and potatoes of the initiation process group is all about creating the project charter and identifying stakeholders. The company will use a business case to justify why they're pursuing a solution to a problem, and the project charter will capture the what and the how of the solution. You gotta know who's involved, both externally and internally, when managing a project, which is why identifying stakeholders is the second process in a project lifecycle. After the initiation process group, you'll head into the planning process group. You need to first understand what you're building in order to figure out how long it will take to build. Then you'll have to figure out all the associated costs for the resources and people, plus the build quality standards. You will need to plan out your make or buy process in your procurement management plan. To tie everything together, you'll have to figure out how you'll manage your stakeholders and communicate to them because they're inevitably going to ask you about project risks. Once you've got enough planning done, you'll start executing on the project. The execution process group is all about directing and managing project work, then continuously learning from it. You'll need to manage the quality of deliverables to ensure that the project quality standards are met. You need to exercise judgment calls to when you will purchase and acquire resources and personnel for your project. Remember that whenever you're dealing with someone else's money, you should try to wait until the last responsible minute to ensure that we aren't sitting on our hands. Once you have your team, you'll have to help them navigate through Tuckman's ladder and direct them to the correct work at the right time. People are often the most challenging part of projects, which means you'll need to manage your communication and stakeholder engagement to ensure everyone involved in the project is aligned. There's a lot of going back and forth between the different processes and process groups within execution. Eventually, you'll need to start monitoring and controlling the project work. Everything you're doing within the monitoring and controlling process group is ensuring that things are on track and that the outcome is the outcome you expect. The entire process, from start to finish, is by definition iterative. It's not waterfall. Your head needs to be on a swivel and you need to remain fluid. Lastly, you'll use the closing process group to transition between different project phases or close out a project entirely. That's it. I'm proud of you. Seriously, we just covered a lot of information, all 49 different processes in the order that they would appear in a project in one video. Please watch this video as many times as you need. If you enjoyed this content, please like the video and subscribe to Cracking Agile. If you have any questions, drop it in the comments section below. We'll figure it out together. This was the second destination on the roadmap to help you with your journey to learn project management. Before we head over to the next destination to talk through how projects unfold in the real world at different company sizes, please head over to my website, download the supplemental materials to this video. I'll drop the links in the description box below. It will help you reinforce the content we discussed today, and you'll be able to practice learning the processes and process groups in your own time. Thanks for showing up today. Your future self will thank you. Until next time.